This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Dan Morrison from the University of Alabama in Huntsville. My guest today is Dr. David Yamane, professor of sociology at Wake Forest University. David is author or editor of 6 books and a longtime specialist in the sociology of religion. More recently, he's turned his attention to guns and has been training and teaching a seminar in the sociology of guns at Wake Forest since 2015. David is the author of Gun Curious, a liberal professor's surprising journey inside America's gun culture, which is scheduled for release in June 2024 and published by Exposit Books. Unlike some guests on the Annex, I've known David for over 10 years, consider him a friend, and have been a guest in his home while at a conference at Wake Forest. So today on the Annex, guns, gun culture, and the wicked problem of gun violence. Our conversation was recorded on May 21st, 2024. Stay with us. All right, David, good to see you and welcome to the Annex. Happy to have you on.
Dan, it's great to see you, and also great to see you, in an occasion other than drinking, because first time we met, we were in the gas lamp district of San Diego, and then in my house. And so it's midday for me and during the week, so I'm not drinking. I can't speak for you.
I have water here, David, and those 2 occasions were special ones because I have responsibilities and obligations. And so not my typical haunts or activities, but just don't want to give people the wrong impression. Well, listen, I learned a lot from your book, which is part sociological analysis and part sociological memoir. I want you to tell us about how you pursued publishing this unique project.
Yeah, so, I entered the project thinking I was just going to do, the standard type of academic publishing that I've done for my entire career, 20 years at that point. And I sent a proposal and several chapters to Oxford University Press. And what I did differently a little bit in the proposal was I did want to center my own voice a little bit more. I did want to have that kind of strong ethnographic voice that a lot of people have been doing really interesting projects with. And the reviews were really split. One reviewer really wanted kind of more academic lean into the literature and that sort of thing. The other reviewer more appreciated the personal voice. But at that point, in trying to think of where was my heart, where was my energy on the project, I really felt like I wanted to center my own voice a lot. And so I really thought, I'm about to be promoted to full professor. My last book in the sociology of religion had come out. And I thought maybe this is the time for me to just try to write a book for a broader audience. So I really leaned into the personal voice. And as I was leaning into that, it really did become, I would say, a kind of sociologically informed memoir. It really weaves together my personal experiences of becoming a gun owner with my sociological observations of gun culture over the past dozen years. So, once I decided to take it in that more trade book route, it brought me into a whole different world of publishing. And we can talk more about that if you'd like. But really, that was the decision moment, was after that set of reviews from Oxford and really driving me into a different direction in terms of where I wanted my voice and where I would need to publish or want to publish based on that voice.
I'm curious what the editor at Oxford said. If you're the editor, you get 2 reviews back. They're very different. And this is not uncommon in journal publishing, I imagine, as well. And so what did the editor say?
Yeah, the editor said, to just have a look at the reviews and think about the way you wanted to go forward. I think the editor leaned more towards the reviewer who said, hey, I'd love to see more of the academic literature in here and that sort of thing. So leaned a little bit away from the person who was more comfortable with the personal voice, but was fairly open. I think there was an open invitation there to try again. And, I could have easily done what both reviewers asked me to do. I've done that many times, both in books and articles. But it was just a moment of thinking, is that what I want to do? Do I want to do another book that's going to sell, a few hundred copies and go to some libraries? Or, do I really want to go out on a limb and try something new and speak to a new audience? And again, I think being tenured gave me a certain level of safety to do that, but also being really on the brink of promotion to full professor really opened me up. So it was kind of almost academic midlife crisis, right? So now what? How is the last third or the last quarter of my career as a sociologist? What's it going to look like?
You're going to be doing this for a long time, David, a long time. All right. There are many ways that we could discuss your book, which, as I said, is set to be released next month. But I think I want to start by following up on the title and ask, how did you become curious about guns, David?
The curious in the title really also, like the book itself, reflects a kind of personal dimension and a scholarly dimension. So, personally, I grew up completely outside of guns and gun culture in the land of unicorns and rainbows known as the San Francisco Bay Area. And then, of course, as you know, sociology, which has been my life since 1988, is a fairly gunless world, I would say. And so I really didn't have any kind of conception of what guns were about until I moved to North Carolina and I started just meeting people I played tennis with, my real estate agent, the IT guys, my future wife. Everybody seemed to have guns. And I thought, well, I'm the only person in North Carolina that doesn't have a gun. I better figure out how these dangerous things work. So, I went out, I shot a gun, and I thought, I was going to be horrified. And I actually found myself quite interested, and I had a good time. I had fun. So that was really a big part of my personal entry into the world of guns. And then at the same time, I was trying to find any project to do other than something in the sociology of religion, because my last book, Becoming Catholic, took me about 12 years start to finish to do. And I thought, man, I have to just do something completely different. So the personal and the professional came together. So it was, again, my curiosity in my personal life about guns and what they were about. And then, as sociologists, I think curiosity is central to what we do. Peter Berger, the first principle is things aren't what they seem. There's an inherent curiosity there, as he puts it, wanting to look through the keyholes or wanting to figure out what's going on in that house across the railroad tracks. So the book really reflects a blending of that personal curiosity and the professional curiosity that we have to have if we're going to be sociologists.
Well, you and I come from somewhat different places. Me from Southwest Missouri, where we had guns all the time. And my father's a big collector of guns, actually, and has purchased quite a number. I don't know how many he has, but David, I would say he has 2 or 3x your arsenal at the very least. Growing up in semi-rural southern Missouri, we had a lot of occasion to have guns, shoot guns, do target practice in our backyard. BB guns as kids, but also then 22s and deer hunting every year, which was a thing we did at my grandparents' farm. So in addition to shooting sports with 4-H and other kinds of things. So for those who don't know about shooting sports, there's a whole genre of outdoor recreation that involves using shotguns primarily, but also sometimes rifles and things to do target practice and also to shoot things like that are called sporting clays, which are clay discs that are flung in various patterns, and you shoot them with a shotgun. I mean, it's a sport in and of itself, but it's also intended to mimic the kinds of skills one would need if you're doing dove hunting or pheasant hunting, other kinds of shooting.
After this original experience of shooting a gun, when I thought, oh, that was kind of fun, let's try and do it some more, the first thing we did was my wife and I went and got her father's old Remington semi-automatic shotgun, and we went out and we shot play targets. And the satisfaction of pointing the gun and hitting this moving orange disc and seeing it explode, it's just the immediate feedback and the satisfaction and the fun is something that a lot of people have long appreciated and I came to appreciate. But it also, your experience is amazing because it really speaks to the diversity of reasons why people own guns. It speaks to the what I call the normality of gun ownership. And it's often hidden. Like if you come from my background, it happens out of sight. It happens on the 5 acres at their house in a rural part of the country. It'd be interesting to know how many other sociologists out there who don't really talk about guns otherwise have some experience either in their family or in their current lives, because I know I was a closeted gun owner for a while just because it's not always comfortable to speak about at the sociology faculty meeting.
Yeah, we're much more likely to talk about perhaps the local sporting team, if you're at a place with a football team or basketball or baseball or whatever, than recreation that involves firearms for sure. Well, as you write and you just alluded to, the quote I have here is, guns are normal and normal people use guns. And so following up on what you just said, I think this might surprise some of our listeners, especially those who have spent decades and decades in academic life. Maybe we should get out more, David. But what did you do in order to become immersed in gun culture? Who did you see? Where did you travel? What skills did you develop?
Yeah, well, I should say that I've put guns are normal and normal people use guns front and center as a kind of counterbalance to the way that most social scientists who study guns approach them, which is to look at the sort of negative outcomes or the downsides of guns and gun ownership, whether in terms of crime, injury, or even what the implications of gun culture could be for democracy. So, I think really guns are paradoxical. Guns are good and bad. So I think that it's hard for us to keep these two contradictory ideas in our minds at the same time. And also, sociologists rightfully study what's wrong with the world, not what's normal about the world. But, having said that, from personally getting into guns, I was very interested in the concealed carry movement. So my initial project was really very discreet to understand why people would choose to get a concealed carry permit and or carry a gun in public. But from there, I realized, sort of just getting into reading about concealed carry and understanding what classes look like, I realized that there was this much broader world out there that I came to call gun culture 2.0, which is the defensive core of contemporary gun culture. So this includes concealed carry and those courses, but it includes a whole defensive training industry. It includes all of the material culture and technology that supports defensive gun ownership. And so, the project kept getting wider and wider. And, I don't even really talk about these other aspects of what I call gun culture 1.0, recreational shooting, hunting, collecting, even though, those things are very prevalent today. The gun culture 2.0 idea makes it seem like, oh, those other things don't exist anymore, but they do still exist. They're just not as central as they once were. But, really spending a lot of time online, in online forums and social media. But I really didn't want to limit myself to that because I think that those are not always the most representative data on what's happening in a particular world. Social media really draws extremes. And I feel like people who only understand and experience gun culture through social media are getting a very limited perspective. So, I traveled a lot. I went to classes. I visited with people. I went to people's back 40s of their farms and had fun shoots on the weekends. Again, lots of things that are taking place that are just out of sight to people who either don't know what they're looking for or not part of those worlds. So, I think fairly traditional kind of ethnographic and interview-based approach and supplemented with a lot of reading and watching of various kind of media.
Well, I want to ask you about your seminar in the sociology of guns, and particularly, I think I saw recently you posted about the first day of class and students' responses. So tell us, David, if you will, about the first day in the sociology of guns. Maybe tell us about the kinds of students who choose to enroll in that class, and then what happens as students start off your course.
So that first experience that I had shooting a gun, where I went in just completely frightened and having no intention of being involved in guns, but coming out of it thinking, well, this is kind of interesting and I had a good time and that was fun. I might want to do that more. That experience was so fundamental to my understanding of guns that when I started teaching the sociology of guns in 2015, I thought I should give students the opportunity to have that kind of same exposure before we even start class. So before we ever sit down in a classroom at Wake Forest, I take the students on a field trip to a gun range, and we do information about guns, gun safety, and a little bit about marksmanship. But then students have the option to shoot different types of firearms on that day. They're not required, obviously that wouldn't be appropriate. But in the last several years, every student has taken the opportunity to shoot all of these different guns. And right now we're doing a very easy to shoot 22 caliber pistol, a 9mm pistol, which is sort of the standard handgun caliber these days, and then an AR style rifle. And the students come away from the experience with all sorts of different understandings. But then on the first day of actual class, they have to write a field trip reflection paper, and we use that as a point of introduction. About 2/3 of the students have never shot a gun before. Some of the students have a little bit of experience shooting, and every once in a while I'll get someone who has a lot of experience shooting. But the modal student in the class is someone who has very little experience with firearms firearms also. And so, I think that makes the field trip experience all the more important because it's not designed to convert them to gun ownership or to say, oh, see, guns are not problematic. It's really just to say, hey, if you want to know why might people like this, or how do they work, or what does it feel like, what might the effect be, then it's good to have some experiential understanding of that, particularly with the AR. The AR is probably the most controversial firearm in America today. And also, I think in some ways, one of the most misunderstood. And so, the students have an opportunity to experience, shooting about 10 rounds through that particular gun.
I'm just imagining signing up for this course, and before you get to the classroom, your professor writes to you and says, our first meeting will be at the A and B gun range.
One of the things I've done from the very start of this class was to have permission of instructor put on the class. So every student who enrolls, I send them a document that says, just so you know, this is mandatory. You can't opt out of the field trip. You don't have to shoot, but if you don't feel comfortable doing that, no problem, no judgment, but you can't take the class. And so, I think I avoid some of those shocked impressions of students by them knowing ahead of time. And now this fall, I'll teach the course for the 10th time. I teach it once a year this will be the 10th consecutive year. So students in the department and to some extent even at the university know that this is an aspect of the course, and they'll take the course in part because that's part of the course, that it's one of the unique aspects. In addition to, I think the topic has not gotten any, less interesting to people in the past 10 years.
That makes good sense, David. Any book about guns and sociology, as you mentioned earlier, is probably going to focus on gun violence. And so we know that gun violence is a significant issue in the United States, including homicide. But the risk of homicide is not equally distributed. And so for those listeners who might be concerned about gun violence as the predominant thing in their mind when they think about guns, what should we be most focused on in terms of gun violence and the prevention of serious issues like homicide?
Well, I think, we need to make a lot of distinctions, so I think to begin with, we have to recognize that there's gun homicide. Suicide is actually the largest proportion of people who are killed by firearms. And yet our suicide rate in the United States we're pretty middling in terms of overall suicide rates for OECD countries, whereas our homicide rate is quite high. And then accidental deaths and injuries are of concern, although that's actually in terms of death, that's a very small proportion of all gun deaths. And then you've got mass shootings hanging out there, which it's a very small proportion, even smaller proportion of deaths on any given basis, but it's really actually a form of terrorism because whether you're likely to be a victim of a mass shooting or not, it's something that weighs on you. So I like to begin any kind of discussion like that by saying, hey, let's make sure we know what exactly we're talking about, because the diagnosis of the problem and the potential ways of addressing it could differ. But, homicide in the United States is really a health disparity. It's geographically concentrated, it's demographically concentrated, it's concentrated in certain social networks. And so, even if you go into, one of the most sort of violence-ridden communities or neighborhoods in the United States, it's really a small percentage of the population there who are in that likelihood of becoming a victim of homicide. So, I think that to me suggests certain types of more targeted approaches to trying to address the issue. And I think sociologists are doing, really good work along those lines, and maybe even more people who are working in public health or criminology. But, I think that the generality is just to say, gun violence is an epidemic in the United States doesn't really give you the information you need to really understand what's happening or what can be done about it.
So related to this, we often do hear that guns are most responsible for homicides. And you point out, as you just said, that these events are actually extremely rare. Even though there are over 400 million guns in the US, only 0.019% of gun owners and 0.00037% of firearms are involved in firearm homicides. So in other words, the absolute risk of becoming a victim of a firearm homicide is exceedingly small. And you compare those risks with others that we tend to accept, such as deaths due to automobile accidents. And I can imagine some readers look at that comparison and say, David, that's not a reasonable comparison. But can you explain to us why that comparison works?
Yeah, well, this is trying to, again, look at the paradoxical nature of guns, right? So if you only look at guns in terms of the relative risk of some negative outcome, then, you may have an inflated concern about the danger of these things. But then also, that overall risk, 5 point whatever per 100,000 in the United States as a whole, that includes 0.00 chance in certain communities and 35 per 100,000 in other communities. So again, I love to look more specifically. And then, talking about substituting the population as the denominator for the number of guns or the number of gun owners, I think that just sort of puts into context that paradox. Yes, guns are very unlikely to be used to harm another person. Gun owners are very unlikely to harm themselves or another person. But given the large number of guns, this happens not infrequently. So I think we need to appreciate both sides of those things. I think that, the difference is that some risks we fully accept and, other risks we're less likely to accept. And again, a lot of this is based on our own personal experiences, right? We drive cars, so we accept the risk of that. We have children who we allow to drive cars, so we accept the risk of that. We go swimming, so we accept the risk of that. We like to drink, so we accept the risk of that. But if we're not gun owners, then we don't appreciate why some people would accept that risk and how they might understand the fact that these things can be terribly misused by some people.
I think one thing that comes through in the book is that some gun owners, at least, particularly ones who own guns for defensive purposes, they come to different conclusions when it comes to risks and risk balancing. They are more likely to say something like, I'm going to accept the risk of having this firearm and storing it responsibly and using it as responsibly as possible, balancing that against the risk of potentially becoming a victim of some kind of interpersonal violent crime. In other words, my concern over crime and becoming a crime victim outweighs my concern and my belief and the steps I'm taking to be responsible in owning and using this weapon should that ever be necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And, I think there are irresponsible gun owners. There are people, who acquire firearms because they think it's going to make them safer and it makes them less safe. We talk about this a lot in terms of people who are in relationships of interpersonal violence, right? And there's a lot of more simple-minded gun advocates who are like, if your man is beating you, you need to get it. But, I think the smarter people who are involved in defensive firearms recognize that that could be the exact wrong thing to do, and that you have to really consider the risks and benefits in a very serious way. Now, we know from however many decades of behavioral economics and Daniel Kahneman's work that, we're terrible risk analysts, right? We're not good at objectively assessing risk as human beings across all aspects of our lives. I like to kind of give credit to people who have thought more seriously about this. And I like to include myself in that of saying, hey, yeah, guns are lethal weapons. And if they're used carelessly or inappropriately, they do increase your risk of negative outcomes. And I, have a whole chapter of the book that talks about that. But there are also ways that, responsible gun owners can mitigate those risks, both of a negative outcome with their firearm or needing to use their firearm for defensive purposes. So a huge part of defensive gun culture is not even getting into situations where you might need to use lethal force to defend yourself in the first place. And I was just at the NRA meetings this past weekend, and it was a common conversation of people, saying, I've been a gun owner for 25 years, or I've carried a weapon concealed for 20 years. I've never had to use it, and hopefully I never have to use it, right? So that idea of Pascal's wager, it's, better to have the gun and not need it than to need the gun and not have it. And in that latter situation, the downside risk of not being prepared outweighs the upside risk of being prepared and not ever needing to use it.
Yeah, I can see how that works. I think what's surprising about what you said, maybe for some people anyway, is that their vision is if I have the tool, I'm going to be inclined to use the tool versus if I have the tool, I'm going to do everything in my power not to use the tool. And so in your book, you definitely talk about these gun safety and personal safety advocates and trainers who spend a lot of time helping people identify situations that they want to get out of before they have to, or before they come into a situation where the firearm seems like a necessary response to whatever is happening.
Yeah, I mean, again, guns are lethal weapon. They can make a bad situation worse. So if there's someone who has problems with impulse control, if there's a person who is in conflictory relationships, either personally or with other people, if you're beefing with other people in your neighborhood, then the gun, definitely makes that potentially bad situation even worse. So the question is whether the typical gun carrier in carrying their firearm is making bad situations worse. And there is some at least theoretical or hypothetical critique of these kind of small arms races, right? Like if I'm a criminal and I know you have a gun, am I more likely to use my gun? When otherwise I wouldn't do that? And if you're a legal concealed carrier and you see someone who you think is going to rob you, are you more likely to go to your gun sooner than if you didn't have it? And so, I think those kind of hypothetical scenarios are really important for any people to puzzle through. I think that the data on, whether more permissive gun laws lead to more bad outcomes, it's still developing. It's a very difficult analytical procedure to try to figure out whether any particular law has an effect on criminal behavior. But, I think there's some suggestions that these permissive laws may have that effect. But then what's the causal mechanism underlying it? Because we know that it's not legal concealed carriers who are engaging in more crime. So if permissive carry laws create more crime, why is that happening? So, I think this is not my particular area of research. It's very complicated, but it's something that I try to keep up on. And, I think I'll be interested to see how that develops.
Right. So free dissertation ideas somehow disentangle the causality with something that you can't do a randomized control trial on.
Right.
Well, we talked earlier about your pathway to publishing this book in a nonfiction press that's not in the traditional academic space. Give us the case of why it's important for you, or why it was important for you to engage interested readers outside the confines of the academic press world, but really with some clear data, some empirical investigation, of course, your ethnographic work, but also mobilizing quite a bit of sociological concepts and theories and engaging with some sociologists and critiquing them, to be frank.
Back when I was just a baby graduate student at Wisconsin, we had a little sort of mini conference among members of our department, and they asked if I would give the sort of opening talk to the conference. My presentation was called Professional Socialization for What? It's actually published in ASA Footnotes, for those of you who remember the ASA Footnotes. But I really argued that professional socialization only oriented toward publishing work for other sociologists and nothing else matters was really very limiting of what we could be as a profession and what I wanted to do as a professional sociologist. And I thought our students are an incredibly important audience for our work, and the general public is a very important audience for our work. So I was advocating for sort of broad audiences from the beginning, but of course you get involved in a career, right? And you need to publish for other scholars to get a job. You need to publish for other scholars to get tenure. And in my case, I had to publish for other scholars in order to be promoted to full professor. And so, there's a lot of incentive not to speak to these broader audiences that I'd long wanted to speak to. Now, I had done some work, on the Catholic Church that was designed to be used by people who are members of the church. And, I always in my mind wanted to reach out to these broader audiences. But, when I decided to kind of go all in on this, the idea really was the issue of guns is so important. It's so fraught. It needs more, as I say, light over heat. If I couldn't say something to make that public conversation about guns better, then what was really the point? I didn't have anything to gain professionally. I didn't have anything really to gain personally by just speaking to other scholars doing sociology. I've also tried to speak to those audiences through articles and book chapters and those sorts of things. But in terms of the big book project, I thought I had a kind of moral obligation to try to make the conversations about guns in America better, because they're terrible.
You mentioned Light Over Heat. You do have a YouTube channel where you produce videos about guns, gun culture. Some of the themes from the book, of course, appear there. I just saw a post about your chief lessons in this project. So for those who are interested, look up Light Over Heat on YouTube. Quite a selection of bow ties. So the content is great, and the bow ties are also worth a peek as well.
Yeah, no, this was another way of trying to say like how do I reach beyond my typical academic peers? And actually above my desk here I have my motto, light over heat. I also have a mission statement that a friend of mine really helped me work through because he, every time I said, "Oh, maybe I should do that or maybe I should do this." He said, "Well, what for? What are you trying to accomplish? What's your mission?" So the mission reads to educate people and enrich conversations about our fascinating, exasperating social world, guns currently, right? So, I think that idea of educating people and enriching conversations is really what everything I try to do is about, whether it's, engaging on Twitter or Instagram or, this light over heat channel, really trying to reach out to people who are concerned about guns, who like guns, but wonder about them. And, really just trying to have a moderate, sane voice in a conversation, which isn't really a conversation in the United States, right? It's more a yelling match and a series of misunderstandings and people, from my cold dead hands, or you guys care about your guns more than babies, that it's just a lot of heated rhetoric. So anything I can do to sort of bring the heat down, I love to do. And that's, the main reason I started that YouTube channel.
You can imagine how for some guns are an unqualified problem, and for others, they are an object of recreation. I mean, they're like tennis rackets. They are a thing that you collect. They're a thing that you talk about. In your travels in gun culture, this really is a subculture. There are gun shows and there are shooting tournaments and there are experts in these fields and there are manufacturers, obviously, and there are innovations in protective equipment and gun locks and sights and all kinds of things. And so, I mentioned my father's a collector of these guns. He also shoots quite a few of them. For him, this is a major way that he gets out of the house. He's been retired for 15 years now, probably. And so this is a big part of the way that he integrates in with other members of his social circles.
Yeah, and again on the kind of public access idea. I'm teaching a public webinar version of my Sociology of Guns course right now. 7 modules that are organized around an essay that James Wright, the sociologist, published in 1995 called 10 Essential Observations on Guns in America. And one of his earliest observations has to do with the fact that firearms are probably the most commonly owned piece of sporting equipment in the United States, although, people who are outside of gun culture don't recognize some of the sports that you're talking about, whether they're informal target shooting and plinking or, extremely formal and elaborate competitions that have national organizations. We should, acknowledge the fact that from the very first of the modern Olympic Games, shooting has been a part of that. And so, some aspect of gun culture, is a sporting culture, and it's long been a sporting culture, back into the times when people were sitting around, bored and they happened to have a firearm and started challenging who could get, hit the tree stump 100 yards away. It's not like unlike the way golf developed, right? You got a bunch of people wandering around in a field and they've got these staves and there are rocks on the ground. So they start seeing who can hit the rock closest to some hole in the ground. And the next thing you have a sport. I think the emergence of these sporting uses of firearms out of necessity and boredom, is a real thing also.
All right, that's good. Well, in the concluding chapter of the book, you share 5 lessons that I found as running themes. So, number 1, shooting is fun. Number 2, violence can be the answer. Number 3, gun culture is inclusive, but some may never feel fully at home. Number 4, gun owners are and should be and can be more responsible. And 5, reclaiming conversations with fellow citizens about guns is important, necessary, and we got to do it. I think I was probably most surprised by number 2, violence can be the answer. Can you unpack that one for us?
Yeah, I sort of begin with this idea of shooting is fun. And so I say, really people who are opposed to firearms, especially fellow liberals like myself, or fellow liberal sociologists or liberal professors, don't really have a problem with this recreational shooting. Like people aren't going to get down on your dad because he likes to shoot targets or hunt. Well, some people get down on him because he likes to hunt, but collecting and these kinds of things are not typically seen to be the problem, right? The real problem that people have with firearms are more the defensive culture of firearms. And, I try to argue that because it's not guns per se, because guns for certain uses is okay, that really there's a very fundamental discomfort with violence itself. And this actually probably ties some into people's aversion to hunting. And I kind of shared that aversion to violence. I thought, no violence is good violence, right? Very much came up as a Martin Luther King liberal, the idea of nonviolent civil disobedience, but then realized that nonviolence and pacifism are not the same thing, right? And that there is a role for violence. The role is very limited, but as this Tim Larkin, whose work I draw on, says, violence is almost never the answer, but when it is the answer, it's the only answer. And, I think that this is something that I've come to be much more at ease with as I traveled through gun culture, where people either through their own experience or through their sort of thinking have come to terms with that. And again, I kind of chide my fellow liberals at the end of that section by saying that, even liberals aren't really against violence. We just like to outsource it to law enforcement, right? So if we need violence done to somebody, we just pick up the phone and, bring the violence in. So, again, it's easy to be misread when you say violence can be the answer, because a lot of people will think that you're saying violence is the answer. But it's really that situation, that moment of last resort, or where no other response will do, that violence will be the answer. And I can tell you, one of the reasons, in addition to just sort of realizing everyone around me had guns and going to the gun range, I also had an experience in my apartment parking lot where one of my neighbors, a very small woman, was being accosted by this man, and I had my two little kids with me, and I thought I was going to be a good Samaritan and go over and help her and say, hey, is everything okay? And the guy let me know in no uncertain terms that I should mind my own business. And the look in his eyes made me realize that violence was not a problem for him, but I had no means to defend myself or my kids if he chose to go that path. So if he went that path, for me, violence would be the answer. But at the time, I had no capacity for it. And not just talking about, firearms, but any kind of violence that you could use in a defensive fashion to protect the people you care about. So that was, very, I think, a pivotal moment in my recognizing, like sometimes you do have to fight fire with fire. Firefighters fight fire with fire. They don't like to do it. It's not, the preferred option, but it is something that you may have to turn to at that moment. Now, I know literal pacifists. I know someone who wouldn't call the police, and I respect the consistency of that view. But I do believe that most of my fellow liberal professors are fine with violence as long as they don't have to do it.
Okay, well, I want to talk about how other sociologists have approached guns. Many study guns. Many of them, I think it's fair to say, have negative attitudes towards guns, obviously towards gun violence, which I think most people share negative attitudes toward gun violence. That's not a surprise. But often that negative attitude towards gun violence bleeds over into negative attitudes about guns in general. So what has your journey within gun culture taught you that other scholars might miss?
Yeah, I think that there is what I call a master narrative of democracy destroying right-wing gun culture that really unites a lot of the
Hmm.
scholarship that sociologists do on guns, which, begins with racist settler colonialism and misogyny in the founding era, that continues through the era of expansion, and then really continues to be what's the central defining characteristic of contemporary gun culture, right? That it's racist, it's heterosexist, it reflects settler colonialism. And, what I think about that is that this is a part of gun culture, but it's not the whole of gun culture. And I don't even know that it's the center of gun culture anymore, right? It may have been the center of gun culture in the 50s or in the 40s or in the 1850s. But gun culture is extremely diverse, today, in terms of who's involved, why they're involved, what they look like, the backgrounds they come from, geographic diversity, and all sorts of other diversities. And so, I think that we have a very limited perspective as sociologists if we only work within that master narrative. And so I'd love to see people branch out. There's been almost no scholarly publishing on African American gun owners, on LGBTQ gun owners, on even on women gun owners. There's some, but really given the representation of these other groups within gun culture, the scholarship has been very slight. And oftentimes you'll get a little asterisk like, I recognize that there are liberal gun owners, but I recognize that there are African American gun owners, but. And so, given our typical sociological focuses, right, on the holy trinity of race, class, and gender, or the quadrinity, if we want to add sexuality in there, it makes sense. Why are we focusing on this limited aspect of the reality? But at some point, we have to kind of shake off our dominant theoretical perspectives or our paradigmatic assumptions and look at the rest of the world around us.
All right. So another dissertation idea, which would be following some groups of gun owners that are not the typical white male, cisgender, heterosexual, right-leaning folks, and asking them about the role of guns, gun ownership for self-defense, but also for other purposes. You said Black gun owners aren't studied. When people talk about Black gun owners, they talk about the Black Panthers in the 60s.
Yeah. And I went to last summer, the National African American Gun Association had its first annual convention. Their membership numbers are exploding. And there's also been a tradition of Black gun ownership that goes way back and continues into the present, even if it's not organized into formal associations. But the fact that it's organized into formal associations really should be, a clue. But I think that we should study these sort of alternative forms of gun ownership and reasons for gun ownership and diverse faces of gun owners. But I can't recommend that any graduate student or untenured faculty member do this, because the master narrative, this dominant paradigm for studying guns, is so powerful that you really professionally can't step outside of it. And I get a lot of graduate students calling me or writing me and saying, hey, I really appreciate the work you're doing. I'd really love to sort of work in this vein. And I have to honestly say, I don't think that's a good idea. That if you write a dissertation or, do any kind of research that isn't sufficiently critical of guns and gun ownership, you're working outside of the dominant traditions of the field, and that's not going to be helpful to you professionally. That's just, a sad reality. It's not limited to guns. I just know that it is the case, in terms of gun scholarship, that the perceptions of guns are so negative within the field of sociology that you can't risk appearing to be sympathetic to guns. Now, again, as a tenured full professor, I can say what I want. I mean, I can be shadow banned by my colleagues, or, just given the cold shoulder, or not having opportunities to publish or attend conferences and that kind of thing, which is fine. I've got plenty of other things to keep me busy, but it'd be very risky for someone who is a graduate student, untenured, or even someone who's not fully promoted to wade into these waters.
Well, I think that's really important to say.
I mean, it's a challenge because I'm basically, posing a counterfactual, right? I mean, it's not until someone would attempt to do this that we could see, like, how well does that person do professionally. But again, I wouldn't encourage anybody to be that canary in the coal mine, or the test pigeon, or the test case.
Well, and there's so much noise in the academic hiring system. In any case, you could probably never figure out whether it was exactly because you did a project on guns that was even remotely trying to understand from a place of sensitive engagement versus, blanket condemnation or something like that.
This also kind of brings me back to this idea that, sociologists study what's wrong with the world, not what's right. And I remember there was a Twitter thread one time where somebody was saying, my students want to know something that has been written in sociology that's positive. And, the people came up with some, ideas, right? But, generally, we are not looking at how great everything is going, or everything that's worked out well. And I think about the place of the sociology of sport in the discipline. The sociology of sport is quite marginal. I remember as being a graduate student on a hiring committee at Wisconsin, and someone was a sociologist of sport, and some of the faculty on the committee were pretty dismissive, just because, like, sport is not serious, even though they were taking actually a critical approach to race and sport. But just the idea of studying sport, was insufficiently critical in itself. So, yeah, again, and there's good reasons for this, how our discipline came into being, why people get into sociology and that sort of thing. So, again, some of this is not specifically anti-gun. It's just kind of anti-talking about anything that's not terrible.
That's true. We do tend to talk about the things that are terrible, and that, with the goal, though, or with the eye to promote some kind of change that would actually end up with a more positive outcomes, but perhaps studying the ways that people create communities of engagement and health, living one's best life in virtue of their connection to others and communities that they value.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Fine can talk about mushrooms and, Little League baseball and chess or whatever else, kitchens. So maybe we can have just a little space, for people to talk about how people can socially organize around firearms and not be, insurrectionist, democracy killers.
Okay, well, let's work on that as a discipline.
I may be that person. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe the role is already filled. Sorry.
All right. Well, we've already touched on gun culture 1.0 about recreation and 2.0 about personal safety and the diversity of the demographics of gun owners in the United States today. Is there anything else that our listeners, both professional sociologists but also others, should take away from your work?
Well, I'm very reluctant to predict what might happen in the future. I have a hard enough time just understanding the present, but I think, one thing to, really keep in mind is that idea of the diversity of guns, gun owners, and gun culture. So even though, I talk about the defensive core of gun culture today. Self-defense has always been a reason for guns and gun ownership, and there's a vast array of different social activities that go on around guns for recreational and sporting purposes that still exist today. So, I'd love to see sociologists get more involved in, for example, studying hunting. The numbers of hunters obviously declining some in the United States, but still exists as a pastime for a ton of people in the United States. And there are certain ways in which it's growing. And students will take my sociology of guns class, and I let them choose their topics. And when students choose to study hunting and then they go out to try and find the sociological literature on hunting, they're actually pretty profoundly disappointed. If I manage to stay in the field of gun studies beyond this book, I might, start looking into hunting a little bit more in earnest myself. The hunters that I've met in the course of my research thus far are, super interesting. They come from, more diverse backgrounds than we might give them credit for. They're oftentimes, far more environmentalist or conservation focused than I am. For me, like, I'm an environmentalist because I wheel my recycling bin out to the corner every other week. They're actually living in the environment. They're attuned to the environment. So if there's a single project that I think that people should undertake, except unless you're a graduate student or untenured or not fully promoted, it would be to study the sociology of hunting, and not just to portray hunters as being, toothless hillbillies.
Yeah.
I don't want to, this is not a comment on your father.
No. But I do think the decline of hunting and perhaps, hunting permits, and there are ways to quantify this, right? Just in terms of number of permits issued, number of permits fulfilled, right? So for those who don't know, and I'm most familiar with the state of Missouri. So in the state of Missouri, you can apply for and really purchase a permit that allows you to what they call harvest, which really means kill deer or turkey, which are the two of the types of animals that are probably most hunted in that state. So you purchase this permit, and that permit allows the State Department of Conservation to track how many hunters there are in the field. And then when you harvest that game, whatever it is, you have to check it in at a station, and they basically take a little tally and a tag, and they tag your kill. They record that so that the state agency, in this case, Missouri Department of Conservation, has a record of how many deer or turkey or other kinds of game animals have been removed from the population in that year. And so you have records going back decades and decades and decades about permits and about how many animals are harvested. And this feeds into efforts to track those populations and to see if there are variations in the number of animals that are being born and are surviving, because we're talking about population management. That's part of conservation, is making sure that we don't have an overpopulation of deer, for example, which would be harmful to other kinds of interests of the state. So, for example, growing crops like corn and wheat and soybeans and things that, I don't know if deer like all those things, but all I'm saying is deer can be very destructive if you have a bunch of them in a place that is otherwise economically productive.
Yeah. Or they wander down into your suburban neighborhood and start eating your garden.
That would be another outcome that people would like to avoid. Part of me is like, well, stop building the subdivisions so close to forested areas where deer live, but that's a different topic, right? But it does show, I think the thing I wanted to say is that the decline in hunters probably has to do with the depopulation of rural counties in the United States. And so if there are fewer people who live close to the land, close to environments where those wildlife are living, then they're going to have less interest or less connection to the kinds of hunting and sporting cultures where you would be reasonable to have folks come into your farm, like happens at our farm every year, and get together for the annual deer hunt and make copious amounts of chili and and sort of have a reunion of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, hunting is so very ritualistic in certain ways. It's very tied to family in certain ways. So, if those rituals and those family ties get disrupted by geographic changes, movement, mobility, then those things I think tend to get severed. I know lots of people who they aren't hunters themselves, but they came from hunting families. The replacement of those people by taking people who didn't come from hunting families and turning them into hunters is, I think, a pretty big challenge.
Yeah, it certainly goes to like childhood socialization. And if you didn't have that, it's more challenging than to pick it up as an adult, especially if you're living in an urbanized area. Well, David, thanks so much for sharing about your book. And I hope people are informed and maybe some myths or some misperceptions have been clarified by the discussion. I want to turn to our banter segment. And I know we had prepared to talk about full professor life, but I actually want to pivot to talk about, since you recently traveled to the NRA convention and we have some mutual interest in bourbon. I want to combine two topics here. So did you have any good food experiences in your recent conference travel? And then secondly, do you have any bourbon recommendations?
The NRA meetings were in Dallas this year, and anytime I travel to a big city, I definitely am trying to find some food, especially food that I can't get in the semi good food desert of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We have some fine restaurants, but they get a little bit old. One of the things I look for when I go to the big cities is to have ramen. And for some reason, even though ramen has been a thing in America for 15 years now, we have no good ramen restaurants anywhere near me, and very few in the state of North Carolina. So a friend of mine who lives in Fort Worth also loves ramen. So he took us to a place in the Deep Ellum neighborhood that's just outside of the convention district. Really interesting neighborhood historically for people who know Dallas. But so, yeah, so I had some great ramen. Did the same thing again the next night, maybe much to my wife's chagrin, because when she sat down, she's like, "Is this a ramen restaurant?" I said, "Yes, of course. You said I could go anywhere I wanted." So, definitely enjoyed both of those meals. Didn't have any super good bourbon because drinking bourbon in restaurants can get pretty pricey or at a conference hotel. I'm actually have more bourbon than I could consume in a few lifetimes. But when we were camping recently in West Virginia near the New River National Park, we went to Smooth Ambler Distillery, which is the first, I think, bourbon distillery in the state of West Virginia. I mean, other than all of the illegal ones. But first licensed distillery.
Important distinction.
That was a cool place because they originally made their reputation on picking sourced bourbon from MGP in Indiana, which just produces a massive amount of whiskey. But now they have been around long enough that they've distilled and aged their own bourbon and rye. So we had an amazing tasting at 8 different bourbons and ryes, four bourbons, 4 ryes. And I ended up walking away from that with a bottle of their rye whiskey that was distilled, aged, and bottled on their own property. So can definitely recommend if anybody comes across Smooth Ambler products, whether it's alcohol they're sourcing or alcohol they're making themselves. Very good spirits and also fairly priced, I think. There's so much overpriced bourbon on the market today, especially the secondary market. But, I love to find really good bourbon at MSRP.
The thing that I think we're lacking in the sociology of leisure is a good ethnography of the world of bourbon. And David, with your collection, you may be a pioneer in more than one subfield. First religion, now guns, perhaps later bourbon. Now, there's quite a good number of books on beer, primarily written by people who have a great enjoyment of that beverage.
Mm-hmm.
but fewer studies of whiskey and bourbon.
Believe me, I have thought about it, and certainly having spent 12 years studying guns, I wouldn't mind moving into a somewhat greener and less fraught pasture for, maybe what could be the final major project of my academic career. But, there's this thing about taking something that you enjoy and turning it into work. It seems like a good idea at the start, but then, if the only way you start to relate to something you love, like bourbon, is, because you're writing up field notes or you're having to talk to somebody else. And so that makes me wary. Although there was a time when I wanted to do a project on mezcal because I was really getting into mezcal, and I knew this friend of mine who was living in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, and he was actually helping to produce mezcal. And I thought, oh my God, I could be a pioneer in this field. I can go down to Mexico. He can introduce me to everybody. And then I saw that a sociologist actually has written a book about mezcal. I don't have it in front of me, but it's an amazing book. And so the project is already done. But I don't think the bourbon book has been done yet. So,
Well, it's kind of surprising. There are many aspects of this. I mean, you could certainly talk about the collectors, traders, the secondary market, the influencers who have YouTube channels that are all about tastings and notes and recommendations.
mhm.
And then there, are, of course, like a small cadre of like superstar people who are in this, who can basically move markets
Yeah.
by their recommendations. So, in some ways, it could be like an economic sociology project as much as a sociology of leisure or consumption project as well.
Yeah. That sounds a lot more boring, though.
Well, that's true. That's true.
I'm particularly interested with the boom, and this is I think basically the same thing that happened in beer
Right.
a generation
Right.
ago is now happening in whiskey, which is it's super popular, and so everybody's scrambling to stand up, their own distillery. But the problem is, and I'm not a beer guy, but I know a little bit about it. Um, you know, you can start a brewery and produce good beer from day one, right? If you start a distillery, you're not producing, good bourbon for 4 8 years, right? So, you then have to sell vodka and gin, or you try to figure out how to quick age spirits so that they're ready in 6 or 12 months and they taste awesome. So it's a very different process than the world of beer. So that, I think that's an angle, is like, how do you create a story around your micro distillery to kind of give it credibility?
Right.
How do you deal with the uncertainty of, trying to make money, while you're getting started up? They actually say, how do you, the gun, not to go back to guns, but I guess that's where my mind is. They say, how do you make $1 million in the gun industry? Well, you start with 2 million. So, it's, uh, and then, I do wonder about so many of these micro distilleries popping up that just are not producing very good alcohol through no fault of their own, but it just takes a long time to make good brown spirits.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a different proposition than beer. I do wonder if another spirit is going to be the next, super craft one, and bourbon and whiskey can like calm down, and so we won't have such rare allocations of things that you used to be able to just go and pick up, but now you have to search out and be in line for at your local liquor store or state-owned liquor store, as the case may be, depending on where folks.
Yeah.
We know that there are a lot of people, back to guns, buying guns. If we just plotted out the number of guns in the per capita in the United States, it's just gone way up in the last 10 or so years, right? Especially after the election of Obama in 2008, there was a big spike. And then I don't know if there was a big spike in 2020 or not, but certainly
Yeah, there was a very big spike.
gun manufacturers and ammunition sales are both up in the last 15 years or so.
But that's, the gun and ammo sales really kind of fluctuate pretty dramatically, right? So can have a big, the Obama boom, which is fairly consistent, but then you've got the Trump slump, and purchasing went, up quite a bit in 2020 and into 2021, but now, it sort of went down again. So to be a firearms manufacturer must be, pretty frustrating and challenging, because the up and down all the time, it would be pretty incredible. But in alcohol, maybe the same way. Like, there's been a pretty long run up of interest in bourbon. And I know I have a connection at Buffalo Trace. And so, when we go there, they're just building these massive fermenters. They're like almost doubling what they can produce. They're building rick houses. And I wonder, at some point is the market going to be saturated with Buffalo Trace? Whereas now I can't find it on, this is it's a very good average bourbon, right? It's not anything special, but you can't find it in the North Carolina.
So you were saying you can't find it? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you take a product like Buffalo Trace, which I think is a very good but average, bourbon, and there's so much focus on anything made by this one particular distillery that that I can't even find it on the shelves of a state liquor store here in North Carolina. But I do wonder, if they double their capacity out there at that distillery, is at some point are they going to flood the market with their product so that they won't even be able to sell what they're producing? They'll be like a bourbon bust. In the same way there's the real estate bubble burst and the gun bubble burst. But yeah, it's I think the dynamics of how the secondary market works and how people perceive the value in collecting certain types of bourbon, that could be an interesting aspect of the sociology of bourbon that you and I are going to get started in the field.
I'll be in touch, David. I'll be in touch.
Who's going to fund our research, though? That's the question. The Distilled Spirits Institute of America, would that compromise our work if that was our funding source?
Great sociologists can definitely be. I don't want to finish that sentence right there. We'll just leave it at the who's going to fund this research and open the question about whether the Distilled Spirits Council, I think it's called, actually. We always break ground and break news here on the NX. So people who want to sponsor a long-running study of the bourbon industry with multiple layers of complexity can be in touch with either myself or David. You can find us if you Google.
Yeah, I think we should make it craft spirits.
Craft spirits.
Why don't we just make it all craft spirits?
Well, that'll be.
We might expand the funding.
That'll be a several book series then. Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, David, thanks so much for sharing the time with me. It's been great to see you and to talk about your very compelling sociological account and sociological memoir of your time in gun culture.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great chatting with you outside the context of a drinking occasion.
Thanks so much, David. You've been listening to the NX, a sociology podcast. Special thanks to Dr. David Yamane of Wake Forest University. Thanks also to our producer and to Joe Cohen, who directs the Queen's Podcast Lab. Music by Lena Orsa.